Ryan, what did we learn from this episode of the Playing with Power podcast?
Green sucks. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Playing with Power podcast, the podcast where we talk about all things cEDH, EDH, and Magic the Gathering. I am your host, Ryan.
And I am your host, Callahan. And today, we are going to be talking about what makes a cEDH deck outdated. These are the factors that go into a cEDH deck just maybe not being as good as it once was, falling behind the pack, maybe being superseded by something else. But first, let's pay the bills. Our merchandise is now available in our store. We have dice, coins, playmats, tokens, sleeves, and more, all available. Go to playingwithpowermtg.com and help support the channel today. You can also support us on Patreon. Patrons get access to our Discord, webcam leagues, playdays, early access to videos, names in the credits of our show, exclusive videos, merchandise, and even the ability to be on an episode. There are tiers available for everyone. So go to patreon.com/playingwithpowermtg and help support the show. Also, if you're looking to sponsor the podcast, please reach out to the email below in the video description or in the podcast notes. We would love to hear from you.
And also, as part of this, we do a Patreon shout out for every single episode. And today's Patreon shout out goes to Josh Stimpson. Josh, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Josh.
Okay, so let's get into our main topic today, which is what makes a cEDH deck outdated. There is a lot of conversation that could be had about this because this is definitely not a black and white topic. It's not like, oh, after this amount of time, that's an outdated deck and you're a bad person for playing it. There are multiple factors that could or could not make a cEDH deck outdated. And also, even with that point, there are people who don't even care about that and still play the deck. So even if you have somebody that comes across the table from you playing what would be maybe considered an outdated deck, people will still play it anyway, and they'll still pick up some wins. So this is a very somewhat ambiguous topic, but we're going to kind of go into some of the strategies today that might consider a deck maybe not as favorable in today's meta, especially if you're picking up something new or you're new to the format, or something that you might want to do to tune up an old list, or maybe something to hop onto if a strategy just doesn't hold its own anymore.
Yes, exactly, Ryan. There's a lot of different factors that can go into this, but kind of just the same as how Magic has always been throughout history. The creep of time is not very friendly to Magic the Gathering decks. New cards come out, newer strategies are formed, new strategies from older cards are discovered that have been bypassed in the past, new things are tried out, and even though cEDH is such a huge format, there's always new stuff coming out for it all the time. I know we talked about this in a previous episode about our set review. Not that many impactful cards recently, but decks are still slowly improving over time, and that does leave some decks a little bit lower on the power spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes we like to think about cEDH decks in the term of eras. There is this era and then there's that era. You'll hear it sometimes in conversations on, message boards and things like Reddit, where you'll hear, well, I played during the Flash era or something like that. And you'll see those types of things define these eras. And a lot of times some of the what would be considered outdated decks are kind of put into those encapsulated eras. For me, I find there is definitely the Flash era. I consider the Paradox era. And then I would consider the Theros Beyond Death kind of era to be in there.
Which we've been in for the last 3 years.
No, we've been in the Commander, what do you call it? The Commander Legends era for the past couple of years, in my opinion. So I would say those are the kind of main ones. And the interesting part is some of these eras are only like 8 months, 8 or 10 months total. Because I think Theros Beyond Death came out in 2020. And then I think it was November of 2020 that year came Commander Legends, and that just kind of turned cEDH on its head.
So only the time period of 3 to 4 standard formats smushed together, that's all?
Yeah, actually, kind of like you said, Magic sets come out, and the flow of time can make things change. I've been playing since 2018 I've been playing cEDH since 2018. I've been playing Magic for longer than
I
some
was about to
people
say,
been
I've been playing
alive.
Magic longer than you,
I've been playing.
but I didn't think that was true.
I've been playing Magic longer than some people been alive that have been
When did
listening
you
to
start
this.
playing Magic, Ryan?
Hardly. Have you seen my last episode? I barely qualify that as playing Magic. So let's go ahead and dive in today. So we have a couple of different, bullet points, if you will, that kind of go into some of the metrics that we define as kind of what we would start to consider a deck being outdated. The first one being certain newer cards that kind of make things too strong. So newer cards that just kind of be a little too strong for what certain decks are prepared or built to go up against. We've seen this time and time again, and we see these dominating right now. It's funny that I mentioned Theros because Thassa's Oracle and Underworld Breach came out in that set. And up until that point, people were trying to battle with very established board states, and they were trying to battle against, things like ISO Rev and stuff like that. And we'll get into a lot more detail later. But certain newer cards just made things way too strong. When they print a card that makes Yawgmoth's Will seem bad, that's a pretty strong card.
Exactly. I think this is where this has been kind of most played out and kind of the most indicative over the last few years is the massive increase of power level in red in specific in cEDH has changed the dynamics of decks a lot. Dockside Extortionist obviously was like the first example. Dockside came out. Dockside, very powerful card for red, but that's just one powerful card for red. And then, here comes Underworld Breach. Suddenly, red is, you have to be playing red to be playing one of, if not the most strongest and most resilient win cons in cEDH. And then here comes Jeska's Will. Jeska's Will, definitely not an Underworld Breach or Dockside level card, but still incredibly powerful. And then here comes this card, and here comes that card. And
Deflecting Swat.
Red is received. Yeah, Deflecting Swat is another massive one. Here's pretty much a free counter spell. In red, you have to be playing red to get access to the fourth or fifth free counterspell that you could be playing. That's another massive power level increase for red. And so if, for example, these newer red cards have become more strong, Sans red decks have not quite gotten incredibly powerful tools at the same rate. Blue, has gotten some powerful stuff as always. Blue has picked up 2 free counters over that same period of time. But like white, they've gotten more powerful in casual EDH, but they've a lot of white decks have incidentally lagged behind because they haven't gotten a Dockside. They haven't gotten a Deflecting Swat and so on and so forth.
Very much true. And these newer cards that just flat out replace some older cards. You have Spell Pierce used to be played in a lot of blue decks, and then an Offer You Can't Refuse came out, and Spell Pierce just left. It's just no longer there anymore. And these, if you're not playing things like Offer You Can't Refuse anymore, and you're still playing things like Spell Pierce, you're finding yourself in situations where you kind of feel like you're lagging behind and you're not exactly sure what that thing is. You're trying to put your finger on it, but you don't know quite what it is. It's because these more powerful versions of these spells are getting superseded and they're getting swapped out in more current and up-to-date decks. And this is what makes other decks fall behind. These newer cards that are being replaced and are being superseded. And we can even go into, like you said, maybe even some more strategy-based things. But right now, these just newer cards are just getting stronger. The fire design of Magic and stuff like that is making sure that every single card is a banger and it sells the set and everyone wants to play it and it turns everything upside down and it makes it so that all these old cards are just unplayable now in the cEDH meta. We're not talking about casual today. We're talking about cEDH. And as such, those can still have a home in your casual decks, but unfortunately, we try to optimize and do the best we can in cEDH, and some of these things just aren't good enough anymore as new Magic cards come out.
Exactly, Ryan. And that does kind of bring us to the next point, which is, sometimes strategies can just be too slow overall. Whatever plan they were trying to execute may just be a little bit too slow today. I think the one of the things that does pop out to me was, I know some people are a really big fan of it, but I personally view control as a strategy in general just to kind of be something that's a little too slow anymore. You can't really try to one for one your opponents as well as you used to be able to. Sure, you can a board wipe and technically go up like 5 cards on everybody, right? You can have your Thrasios Vile Smasher or your Nimrus or whatnot that really helps you try to keep up on that card advantage race while you're one for oneing everybody with your counter spells or your removal spells or whatnot. But it's just not quite fast enough anymore because you have to pack so much interaction in order to effectively control the board that past a point you're putting in these well below rate interactive spells, like maybe Miscast, for example, is another interactive spell that has kind of fallen off the bandwagon. Maybe you are picking up that, and in instead of playing that, you're not playing, I don't know, insert a really proactive card here that other decks in your colors might just be playing because they're trying to jam that proactive spell to try to go and win the game.
Mm-hmm.
Just slows you down.
My example of this is actually what we talked about right before we started today, which was your baby. It's Rashmi.
It's Rashmi. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that whole thing about control is pretty much based in my experience of playing Rashmi for years and years, and it's suddenly not being good enough anymore.
Yeah, and why? Because you try to churn out. I mean, you're a control deck, so you're not trying to turbo out anything. You're not trying to turbo things out. You're trying
to turbo out Rashmi so I can turbo out cantrips. Woo!
Watch out, everyone. You know, it's like, and that's too slow because by the time you turboed out Rashmi, oops, game was over. And you're like, I didn't have a chance to get my engine online that's in my command zone, and the game's already over. And that's a problem for control. And so things kept getting faster. People start getting greedier. Things started to get more proactive. And we found that the more mid-range piles that could, counter certain key pieces earlier, counter turn 1, 2, and 3 win attempts, and then it got at its engine online, were better suited and equipped to do that, but were able to not be just on the control/table police plan to be able to win the game. They just overwhelmed you in advantage. And that's not the archetype of control. It's not an advantage, archetype. It's a literally what it's called. It's a control archetype. And it just found itself not being able to 3v1 everyone all the time. And it used to be able to. That's the thing. Curious Control had ways to, gain control of what it was doing, as well as, ping opponents through the Vile Smasher curiosity effects and stuff like that. But Curious Control finds itself very out of favor. The original author actually gave up on it. They said, you know what, this isn't really an archetype that we really want to pursue anymore. I'm going to move on to other things. And another player picked it up, which was super awesome. And they're trying to do what they can with it. But it's because control has just fallen out of favor.
Exactly. And the experience of playing Rashmi was a very interesting one because there was a time where when I was still playing Rashmi where it was kind of objectively correct. My Rashmi deck had already been superseded at a point in time when control was still a decently viable archetype, and that was when people figured out that you could just play Thrasios Vile Smasher, pick up black and red, 2 quite powerful colors, and still be able to get a lot of the same card advantage by. It was called 4-color Rashmi for quite a while because you would put curiosity effects on your Vile Smasher, and then that would just do the Rashmi impression of drawing you a card every time you cast one of your counter spells or whatnot. And even at that point in time, Rashmi was like still superseded, but it was still playable, but it was very superseded just by those partners being printed that enabled that strategy to be a better version of Rashmi.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Another one I would say that is something that is a little bit too slow for today's metas are the hard stacks variants, the lock you down prison style stacks effects. I didn't say stacks as a card is too slow for today's metas because they're still perfectly viable. We see stacks played all the time in today's metas. We see the collectors and stuff like that. I'm talking about the hard stacks lockdown variants, hard stacks being the one that is just too slow. If you're looking to cast Armageddon in your games of cEDH, it's probably not working anymore. And I'm going to use the example of my good friend Charles. He's called the Mono White Guy. He's been a patron of ours for a very long time and also a very good friend of mine for a very long time. And he plays Mono White, obviously, in case you didn't tell from his name, his moniker online. But what he used to do is he used to play with us in Mox Pro games. He still does, by the way. And he would bring his Mono White decks. And his Mono White decks used to just slay us. They used to absolutely just burn us out of the table. And we were like, what is going on? I can't do anything right now. His decks that are still mono white as of late are actually having a lot of trouble doing the exact same thing. And you could make an argument that we've learned his strategy, and that's not what it is. We know how his strategy works, and we know when things do and do not need to stay on the table. But what it really is that he's having a lot of trouble. His decks are having a lot of trouble just keeping up with the table. Not to say he's not a good player, not to say that his decks aren't great, just to say that this format has gotten so quick that he has trouble just saying planes pass. It's really difficult for him to just do that now because he finds himself so far behind after turn one that it's really, really hard to keep up at that point.
Certainly, Ryan. Yeah, this is the kind of the thing that's most common, I think, of all of these things on the list that we have here, and a lot of the things that we have on the rest of the list are kind of almost subvariants of this, strategies too slow because of these other reasons, because we're here to win fast. And if you can't win fast, then you got to have 20 counter spells to stop all your opponents who aren't winning fast and praying. Mm-hmm. So
yep. And that's not to say that stacks pieces, like I said earlier, are not viable. They're absolutely viable. I'm saying stacks as a strategy. Hard stacks, prison, lock type stuff is a very difficult strategy to actually win the game with. And that's what we're saying, just to be 100% clear here. All right, kick us off with the next one.
Yep. Up next, we have a deck might become a little bit outdated because it relies on combos that are overshadowed by modern ones. I think definitely for those of us who've been playing cEDH for quite a while, I think you definitely noticed when ISO Rev, which is Isochron Scepter with a dramatic reversal, imprinted upon it to make infinite mana thanks to you having rocks that make more than 3 mana every time you tap all of them. That combo was very popular until suddenly one day it was not. What happened on that day in early 2019?
2020. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, 2020. I always think it's 2019.
I get it. They blur together. Yeah.
In early 2020, Theros Beyond Death was printed. Right as COVID started up, right as cEDH webcam exploded all over, ISO Rev was instantaneously and immediately ousted by this new card, Thassa's Oracle. If you were in blue and black, you didn't have a reason to have to mess around with this honestly quite hard to assemble and very interactable win con anymore in ISO Rev. You could make infinite mana, and then sure, what were you going to do with it? If you had Thrasios in the command zone, then sure, then you were winning the game on the spot. But otherwise, there was, again, mentioning Rashmi again, ISO Rev was like the main way you would win. And sometimes you just wouldn't have a way to win with that infinite mana in hand. You can make infinite mana. That's a good way to win the game. And then you have to have something to do with it. Thassa's Oracle doesn't have that problem.
That's right. So the major thing with ISO Rev, we're just using it as an arbitrary example here. There's one of other ones we have as well. But ISO Rev required a board state in order to win. So you needed, obviously Isochron Scepter and Dramatic Reversal, all that kind of jazz, and you would activate it. But you also needed something that would net you mana. So you need to have rocks on board or something on board like dorks to net that mana to have infinite mana out of it. And it was just an infinite mana outlet. A lot of times you saw these in the Thrasios X variants, Timna Thrasios, blah, blah, blah. But you could sink that mana into Thrasios, then win the game from there. And what you would usually do is you would generate infinite mana, draw your deck with Thrasios, land a Lab Man or a Jace Wielder of Mysteries, and then draw a card through Thrasios and win the game. But Isochron Scepter was kind of the main thing. There were decks that were even named after it. ISO Rev was like UPS, Urza Paradox Scepter. Scepter was Isochron Scepter in the very early version of Urza. And it just required too much setup to work when all I had to do was have 2 cards in my hand and literally nothing else. I had to have Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation or Chain of Pact, and all I had to do was cast one, trigger it, cast the other, win game. Super hard to interact with. It became super, it just everyone knows what it is now. I don't need to give it any more introduction, quite frankly. But if I had my choice of either having that or having all this setup and then land ISO Rev and then cast it and hopefully it didn't get countered or didn't get destroyed or didn't anything else, then I could win the game. And all that kind of setup just wasn't necessary anymore. So it quickly fell out of favor when this happened. And as such, we hardly see it at all anymore. And usually when we do see it, it's almost a throwback. We're like, wow, Shorkai plays ISO Rev? That's so crazy. How fun,
Yeah, I was about to actually mention that. Like these days, there's kind of like 2 decks that play ISO Rev. There's like Urza Polytyrant plays ISO Rev in it, and Shorikai Polytyrant plays ISO Rev in it. And in both of those instances, it's like your C plan.
It is.
If you can't polymorph into Hullbreaker Horror, then well, at least we have ISO Rev, and I hope it works out.
Exactly.
It's very much the attitude in both of those decks. So this is a combo that has incidentally gone from being like A+ premier tier combo for blue X decks into being the C plan for very specific decks that happen to already play a lot of artifacts and happen to already have a commander that will let you win on the spot if you assemble it.
And that's really the thing. Like you said, with Rashmi and ISO Rev, if you didn't have a way to sink that infinite mana into it or some payoff with it, Azami had it because you could draw your deck with Azami. If you didn't have some sort of payoff to that, it just felt too clunky to actually work. And so that's why it kind of got superseded. These combos got overshadowed by these more modern, more compact, more easy to win combos. Then have all this board state, generate infinite mana, and then, find a way to use that infinite mana or infinite storm to actually win the game. So there were so many different pieces that had to fall into place just to make this work that it just wasn't worth running anymore. And that's why it got replaced by, like I said, the Thoracle Consults. Ideally, a lot of combos got replaced by Thoracle Consult, but that's just kind of like one of the main ones. There is another one, and that is Doomsday. So Doomsday kind of used to be a premier WinCon enabler, and you could see this in a lot of Esper decks. Zur Doomsday is kind of one of the quintessential ones that you would see. You would get Zur onto the battlefield, and then you'd start to crack it with like the old classic Legacy Doomsday type things. You'd either use Gush or you use Git Probe or something, and you end up winning with a Lab Man effect. But Doomsday has fallen way out of favor. Now, is there any one single thing that actually replaced Doomsday? I would say probably it wasn't a 1-for-1 so much as we're kind of using ISO Rev versus Thoracle, but it was more like the Breach era is really what it was. It was the Underworld Breach era that kind of said, Doomsday, you've had your time, but exiling everything, we could do that by escaping cards, and using a brain freezer or grinding station strategy to win the game. So I would say that kind of the time that we really saw Doomsday fall out of favor was after Underworld Breach became legal.
Yep, exactly. And in almost the same way as ISO Rev, you still do see Doomsday in a couple decks these days, but it's like Prosper, because you literally use Prosper to crack your Doomsday pile in your end step and win at instant speed. Sometimes you'll still see it in Yuriko, because Yuriko can also crack her own Doomsday pile and then just like win on the spot. But it's not that always ever present win con that it used to be.
That's exactly right. And so that's basically the kind of the gist of it is when you see better win cons come out or better strategies to enact in order to execute your individual plan, you find that these things just kind of get a little bit more and more difficult to justify in your deck, because you want to try and minimize the amount of dead cards in your deck as much as possible. If you drew Isochron Scepter, you're just holding that card. I mean, sure, it's cheeky to put Mana Drain under it, but that's not how you're wanting to win the game. You want to put,
because then if you want to win the game, you have to figure out how to bounce it back to your hand so you can re-imprint it with Dramatic Reversal.
Exactly. And so these types of things, you don't want to have dead cards in your hand. So Thoracle Doomsday, Thoracle Consultation is, Tainted Pact isn't a dead card. You could Tainted Pact on the end step and find a card that you might want. It could you could find the other half of your A+B combo, or you could, desperately search for an answer. Consultation's the same thing, albeit really risky. Sometimes it does not pay off to do it that way, but it is at least not a completely dead card. So the only thing in that A+B combo that we would consider you'd never want to cast it outside when you're actually trying to win is Thoracle itself. Isochron Scepter had a lot of additional things. If you were casting Dramatic Reversal to untap your permanents, you were in a tough spot back then. You were basically losing that game, so you needed the mana. And so those were 2 dead cards, plus all this setup and all of these other things. And that's just why these types of things fall out of favor. Same with Doomsday. If you were drawing Doomsday and you drew a piece, that you had to try and assemble a different Doomsday pile. And you either tried to execute your Doomsday right away, or you had to hold on to your Doomsday, or if you're trying to draw a card through something and your Doomsday was wheeled around or anything like that. Doomsday was a little bit more clunky, but that's because the meta was slower. And so now it's a lot harder to justify Doomsday unless you're powering it out really, really early. So you're almost tutoring for it, then dark ridding it into the actual Doomsday pile to win.
And much the same as we have gotten more and more modern combos every time that replaced older ones, we have over time gotten better strategies for the same commander. This is definitely different than the traditional thought of a cEDH deck being outdated, which is just like throw the baby out with the bathwater, just get this entire deck, this commander, this strategy, get it all out of here. It's all just too slow. This is more so kind of a deck evolving over time, but it's evolving in almost 20 card chunks. So in a lot of ways, it's kind of like an entirely different deck, just with the same commander at the head. Do we have any examples of this, Ryan?
Yep. I would say the first one that always comes to mind is Yuriko. So the early versions of Yuriko that you started to see were Yuriko Doomsday. How about that? So you would assemble Doomsday, you'd use Yuriko to crack your Doomsday pile and then win the game. And then what happened is it kind of, as Doomsday was falling away and the Nas strategies were starting to really explode in popularity, because Nas has been around for quite a while. It's always been a strategy in a 40 life format. But it kind of evolved into Yuriko Turbo Nas. And you were trying to resolve an ad nauseum and win. And so it got so sped up because there was this big chasm after some bans happened, which we'll talk about a little bit, that everyone was just jamming Nas into every single deck they could jam Nas into. They actually do that today, even though some shouldn't really probably have it. But that's another conversation. But we saw Yuriko Doomsday morph and evolve from the Doomsday type strategy with all these kind of dead cards that are only really good in a Doomsday pile into this more Turbo Nas strategy where everything is a really, really low CMC, and you could crack a ad Nas and all of this stuff would end up in your hand. You could find a way to win. And interestingly enough, we have started to move away from Yuriko as a Turbo Nas strategy because one is kind of the antithesis to the other. I pronounced that wrong. Anyway, but, you want to flip really big things off of your Yuriko because that's kind of its strategy. So what it actually morphed into, because one was kind of contradicting the other, was I want really low CMC for my Adnos, but I want a really high CMC for my Yuriko, was it morphed into a Yuriko tempo type strategy. And we saw maybe some more extra turn stuff, some, random really high things like Blink Moth Infusion. I love that card inside of Yuriko. It's just 12 or 14 mana value card that just domes everyone for 14 when you flip it with Yuriko. It's so cool. but it's not completely dead, even though it kind of is dead. It's just a really high mana value spell. But we saw this kind of evolution of Yuriko. And, there's Yuriko turn somewhere in there, and some would say that kind of followed it through a lot of it. And, that could be also be kind of an alias of tempo nowadays even. But we saw Yuriko stay the same commander, stay the same basic approach, but different evolutions of that deck over time. We saw it go from a Doomsday Pile enabler to a Turbo Adnos kind of thing into a tempo variant, but it was still Yuriko attacking with ninjas.
Exactly. And another big thing that did really bring around the tempo change was that Kamigawa Neon Dynasty happened, and suddenly we had a lot more ninjas than we had in the past, and new ninjas, which were much more powerful and all have an ETB effect or all have an on damage effect that you care about. Where in the past it was like, I guess I'll play this Changeling from Modern Horizons 1 because it's in my colors and it's a ninja, I guess. It's unblockable.
Exactly.
So it'll always trigger Yuriko, but you were playing cards because you had to trigger Yuriko, and now it's been able to move a lot more towards playing cards that you want to that trigger Yuriko, which I think is it specifically for that deck a really important distinction to make.
Yeah, Slither Blade and stuff like that, trying to connect and stuff like because I think it's just a Naga. I don't know, is that a ninja? I want to say it's a ninja anyway. But you had things like Universal Automaton, which was that little 1-drop artifact with Changeling. And then you got in Kamigawa, Nashi, Moon Sage's Scion, which is like, wow, this is really good for Yuriko. I totally want to run this. And other things like that, where you weren't really trying to scrape the bottom of the barrel to enable the Yuriko strategy to really execute. You could tempo people out by just attacking with actual valid ninjas that are really good and help your strategy a lot. Versus, like you said, well, let's see what I can assemble. I'll try and crack it, and I'll use this, but it's not really great. And that's just, that's what happens when these strategies come out that just evolve whenever a new set comes out that really caters to a commander, or just a new card that really caters better to a commander's combo or something along those lines.
And in that same vein, we also saw Kinnan is another deck that definitely changed a lot. Kinnan changed a lot. In the past, for the longest time, Kinnan was kind of like, okay, we're going to be this random Simic deck that has some big creatures in it. And oh god, I hope, I pray I find Basalt Monolith so I can win the game with my infinite mana combo. But then we were like, wait a second, we're making so much mana already. We can just get a ton of mana, activate Kinnan once or twice a turn cycle, and just cheat in these gargantuan guys who will just win the game for us on their own. Void Winnower, Nezahal, Coma, I forget the name of the massive serpent that makes serpents every turn, but that just ends games. You just can play all of these basically game-ending creatures in your deck, and it doesn't matter. You can play 20 of them because you're putting them into play for an activation of your commander that itself gives you so much more mana to activate it with. It wasn't exactly like new cards being printed or anything. That was just an instance of people being like, wait a second, we're just overlooking the good part of this deck.
And not to mention that, you're like, oh, well, if your Kinnan's offline, these cards are dead. Not really. If you don't want to flip into them for any reason, you could just cast them because you had so much mana.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And so it wasn't just like colorless Eldrazi. It's like you said, these really big, flavorful, quite frankly, creatures that you don't normally see at a cEDH table, when people are just like shrug their shoulders and like, I don't know how to deal with a Void Winnower. I don't know how to deal with a Consecrated Sphinx that isn't exactly like what would also deal with a spell. Like, maybe I guess I could bounce it, but it looks like you have just 12 mana or 10 mana or 11 mana, just recast the dumb thing. And so I was like, this is a really rough situation, especially Coma. Coma really, man, it domes people. It's really difficult to deal with. And it's, we could go on with Coma for hours, but it's exactly what you said. We saw Kinnan kind of be like, okay, infinite mana outlet, the Basalt combo or whatever. Then you kind of saw like House of Mirrors kind of stuff, where it's that Mirage Mirror plus Basalt thing and this complicated thing to try and generate this infinite mana. But then what we really saw was the big flip strategy as you're describing it. And we were like, wow, this is actually pretty effective, because cEDH doesn't deal with big, large, fat, dumb creatures. Like, they try and combo off as soon as possible, but when you have Coma, tapping down your key permanent or something like that on your upkeep, and you can't execute your win, and then it just attacks you on top of that, that's pretty hard to deal with. And a lot of people don't pivot that well into that type of, opposition.
Exactly. And much like better strategies for the same commander have happened, we have time and time again see better commanders replace old ones for the same strategy. So, you'll be doing the same strategy, but there's just a better commander in the command zone. I think one of the preeminent ways that we saw this happen over time for us old head cEDH players, it used to be the mono blue deck was Azami. You get to control the board. You get to draw a lot of cards for your commander. You win with ISO Rev, drawing your entire deck. And then over time, and this kind of happened to any of the blue commanders. There used to be Teferi Time Veil, which I know somebody on the West Coast. There's one pilot on the West Coast playing Teferi Chain Veil very well.
There's one
won
left.
The Cash Cards event.
Yep.
I got top 16 at Silicon Dynasty. This guy's on something. He's doing something right. But nobody else is playing Teferi Time Veil anymore. Cole is still playing Azami. Nobody else is playing Azami anymore. But all these blue commanders all suddenly kind of got sucked up into Urza decks. Once Urza was printed in Modern Horizons 1, there was suddenly not really a reason, quote unquote, to play these other decks anymore, because Urza was just so much better. He costs 4. He makes all your artifacts of any type cost blue, so you could play all these great stacks pieces that you could tap for mana and turn off for yourself, like all the old artifacts, stacks pieces, and then you could use all that mana to, again, he's also an infinite outlet in the zone, so if you make infinite mana, he can just win the game on the body himself. He even makes a huge creature when he enters the battlefield, so he can help protect your life total. This was just so much better in every way than all of the rest of the blue commanders, that suddenly you had to have a really good reason to not be playing Urza anymore if you wanted to play mono blue as your color identity.
Yeah, that was the conversation. How is this better than Urza? Would be the question that would come out with every new blue legendary. How is this worth running over Urza? And a lot of times the question would just be, it's not. I'm sorry, the answer would be, it's just not. And so they don't run it. And so some people would try and do some fringe brews and stuff like that. I'm glad some people did, because Emery got the same treatment. The first thing that people said was, how is Emery Lurker of the Lock better than Urza? And a lot of people just immediately shrugged it off and said, it's not better. But some people took Emery and they did some stuff with it. And there's some really cool things you can do with Emery. But it fell into that problem. The second one I would say that happened was after Commander Legends came out in late 2020. Everyone asked the question, how is this better than Partners? Partner 1 and Partner 2. How is this better than that? Cormella, Glamour Thief, I think her name is, it came out in New Capenna. She was a Grixis commander that had haste and tapped for Grixis. They're like, oh man, a new Grixis commander, and there's mana, and this is what a great a thing. And it gets things back and all this, whatever. And so there's all these things.
Damn, why aren't you just playing Rogside?
Yeah, exactly. They're like, how is this better than Roger Silas? And everyone's like, it's not. It's not better than Roger Silas. And so a lot of the win got taken out of the sales and continues to get taken out of the sales of a lot of different commanders that come out all the time from a cEDH perspective, simply because you unfortunately have the question, how is this better than Partners? And a lot of times the answer is just, it's not. So you're running it for flavor, which is fine, by the way. But if you're talking about optimal strategies and doing the absolute best you can with a particular approach or a play style or something like that, a lot of times Partners just win. And we saw these commanders get replaced, and they just can't get, until something is literally better than Partners. It's really difficult to make that argument. And so a lot of these commanders, they just got pushed out. It's just the very basic thing of it. They took their old one commander and replaced it with Partners that just do things better, or their generic colors, but to just execute the, mana or card advantage better. And that's a very common problem that happened. And
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that you think we're in the Commander Legends era right now. Like if we're in an era right now for cEDH, it's like the Commander Legends era. And I think that in that vein, the partners are a really big part of it. The single color partners that were printed in Commander Legends are a huge part of this. Better Commander replaces the old ones. Because if you were just playing a Commander for colors, why not have two generic cards in your command zone instead of one fairly generic card in your command zone? Why play insert is it commander when you could play Malcolm plus red partner, right?
Yeah,
Unless you
Malcolm
have an
Roger, Malcolm
explicit, yeah,
Breaches, Malcolm, yeah,
exactly.
all these.
So, that I think that's a really big factor in the better commanders replacing the old ones. Yeah, we can talk about Urza over Azami, or we could talk about Yeva over Azusa, though those, I guess those were not printed at significantly different times. But in reality, a big factor in this was the printing of those single color partners that made partners not just a 4-color thing or a 2-color thing. Those were kind of like your options, or a 3-color thing, but people really didn't do that. Now you have all of these. You can pair Malcolm with Tana to make a great teamer deck rather than some of the other teamer options. You could pair
Dargo
Roger.
Thrasios, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You can pair Dargo with Thrasios. You can pair Roger with Silas, and whatnot, to make these incredibly good 3-color combinations or 2-color combinations or whatever that are just better on rate than a lot of the historically played commanders in those color identities.
Yeah, you actually see very few Grixis commanders nowadays at the current tables that aren't a partner of some sort. Malcolm Vile, Roger Silas, Armix Crom. I could go on and on. And then you're like, well, what about Inala? Yeah. How often do you see Inala at the tables anymore? It's fallen.
Well, there's one very good Inala pilot on the West Coast.
There's one
that really gets people. Shout out to Justin.
Yeah, one
that really
once again.
gets people. Yeah, exactly. With Inala. And
yeah, you actually see Kess is a really good example of an outdated commander, because Kess is still a good strategy, but everyone's like, man, partners just do it better. I'm not saying that Kess isn't great and people still don't play Kess, because they do, but they're holding on to their love is what they're doing. It's not that this is the best thing to do in Grixis. It's like, no, I just like Kess, and I'm going to, pay 4 to cast a spell from my graveyard. It's like, gosh, man, Snapcaster Mage does it for 2. Yeah, it's like it's not even a great rate to do it, and it's once a turn and all this other stuff. But Grixis wants to end the game long before you want to start to enable a cast strategy, and the partners are just doing it better, and so that's why these things are starting to fall out of favor as a result.
And one more thing that did impact commander choice over the last few years within the same colors is, again, from Commander Legends. I feel like this is a card that we definitely should have mentioned by now, but that's Jeweled Lotus. Jeweled Lotus has massively impacted like the quote-unquote playable cEDH commander choice, because if you're not giving yourself the advantage of being able to quickly cast your commander off of a Jeweled Lotus, like on turn 1 or even turn 2, then what are you doing? Why are you not enabling yourself to play Black Lotus, right? So like, you could play Yidris if you wanted to play Sans White. It's a really cool color. We mentioned this when we were talking about Abaddon in a recent set review podcast episode. We were like, yeah, why would you play Yidris as your Cascade commander when you could play Abaddon as your Cascade commander? Why? Because you can cast Abaddon very easily off of a Jeweled Lotus. A Jeweled Lotus gives you 1 mana towards Yidris.
Yikes. Oh, it plays the commander tax later. You don't want to be in that position.
No, that's not where you want to be.
Yeah, because Yidris, you can maybe shave a turn off with Yidris. Like, you can power out a rock or 2, but like, even Soul Ring doesn't help Yidris. And so it's in such a bad spot. And it, once again, got superseded because of it. So, on that vein, talking about really difficult colors and casting, let's talk about colors that got stronger over the past couple of years, and also by that association, colors that got weaker over time. Back when we started playing, Timnath Thrasios was the deck to play. Full stop. period, nothing else. It was the deck to play, it was the deck to beat, and it was sans red. Because red was the weakest color back then. And I mean, white was technically the weakest color, but it still had good support cards, had silence and stuff like that. And you could use it with Tymna. But Tymna Thrasios was the deck to play. It was the strongest one. All of this advantage. But like, even if you think about it, the rate on Thrasios is horrible. Pay 6 to draw 1 card. Pay 10 to draw 2. That's horrible. Unless it's an infinite mana, then it's really, really good.
Thrasios costs 4 to activate, Ryan.
6 mana to draw a card, right? 2 plus 2 to cast him.
Okay,
plus 4.
ignore me.
And then, so that's
Okay,
6
you
plus
got
4,
me
2
there.
cards. I'm pretty sure I can math this early in the morning. I could be wrong.
I didn't think about casting the commander itself, Ryan. I'm a silly little goose.
It's okay. It's early. It's okay. But these were the strategies to beat. And now a lot of people, when you ask them what the weakest color in cEDH is,
green.
It's green. It's
green.
And why? Because all the toys that green has received over the last number of years has been for casual commander. Really cool green bombs, ramp spells, these crazy things. Like you see the Nyx Bloom Ancients, and you see all these crazy big, game-ending things that you see in casual commander, which is awesome. People love green in casual commander. That's great. But it doesn't receive very many good cards for our end of the format. We saw like Collector Roof back in Modern Horizons. There's Veil of Summer. There's some other things that are here and there. But like, it doesn't really get really great cards that frequently, and every time that a new great card comes out, it seemed to be in red there for just years and years, and the Tymna Thrasios players found themselves really missing red. They were like, wow, I really wish there was a dockside right now, to the point where they would run Phantasmal Image in their decks just so they could get a dockside. And it became so overwhelming that Tymna Thrasios has really fallen off the radar, just because its colors have, by association, gotten so much weaker in exchange for all the stronger and stronger colors that have been happening over these last couple of years.
Right now, once again, on an episode of the Playing with Power podcast, I am referencing cEDH.guide. And I am looking at their stats page, and I am looking at like the top 10 cards by play amount for each different color. And I'm looking at green, and I'm looking at red, and I'm looking at white. Back when we started playing cEDH, back in the Flash era, basically when I started playing seriously, you played Tymna Thrasios, and you were in white basically because you had to play white to play Tymna, because Tymna was such a good value engine. And yeah, you had Enlightened Tutor, and you could play your Silence and that kind of stuff. And eventually they picked up Draenith Magistrate, which was useful. But I'm looking at these cards right now, and if we look at the cards in the top 10 of green from the last few years, they're all really edge case role players that are quite strong cards. You have Beseiju, who endures. One of the best cards in cEDH. It's a land. It's a great reactive, but it's not technically winning the game. You have Veil of Summer, a great protective piece. That's still from 2019. Geesh.
I was about to say, isn't it from 2019 or 2020?
It's not that new. Core 2020. Once again, getting 19 and 20 mixed up. Veil of Summer, it's from 2020. It's like getting to be 3 years old now. Veil of Summer, very good reactive piece. It can protect your win. It's not winning you the game. And then Eldritch Evolution, 2018. Really good for your creature combo decks, and that's it. And then I'm looking at the red cards here. Number 1, Dockside Extortionist. Dockside Extortionist wins you the game. Number 2, Deflecting Swat. We talked about it earlier. That's another free counter spell. That's incredible. Ragavan, people are split on Ragavan. It's a fine little value card, but still, Ragavan probably better than any green card in cEDH that's been printed in like the last 2 years besides Beseiju. And then, of course, also Underworld Breach. It wins the game. It's a red card that will win you the game on the spot. Looking at the white cards, Esper Sentinel, printed a year and a half ago or whatever, right up there with it's a far third place behind like Mystic and Ristic, but it's still like the third best card advantage engine in the format probably. And it's a white 1-drop. Ranger, Captain of Eos, my pick for like the sleeper best card in cEDH that people never respect enough. You get to play it, you get to silence somebody whenever you want, whether it be on your turn to protect your win or to stop from somebody else from winning. And on an ETB, it fetches up your Esper Sentinel for you to just immediately be able to play and have a great value engine. Drannith Magistrate, like I said, a few years old now, but still an incredible white card that it didn't have in the past. Grand Abolisher, kind of a card that people didn't play for a while, but have picked up as of late. The difference in between these red and white cards in comparison to these green cards, just within the top 10, I know there's more role players that red and white have gotten to past these best in the format, top 10 played in color identity type of cards too, that green just has not gotten. The difference is so stark, and that has set so many green decks back in comparison to sans green decks, or even decks that happen to have red and white with them in addition to green, in comparison to decks that don't have these white or red and green cards, that it has itself just wiped out swaths of decks in comparison to others.
Agreed. If you look at the kind of the best cards that is received over the past 3 years, you look at just kind of all the things that you said. It even got red got Bergie. It got Professional Facebreaker. You know, like some people hate it, some people love it, but people are playing it. If you go to cEDHstaples.com, it takes an aggregation of all the decks on the deck list database, and it kind of groups them all together to say, hey, what cards are people playing? What's the meta look like right now? So at least from that perspective, you can kind of get an idea of what cards are being seen in certain decks. And we're not talking about that random edge card that nobody plays, that is a silver bullet in your particular one color deck. That is not what the cEDH Staples list does. And that's also not what we're talking about. Yes, there's always going to be a silver bullet printed against one particular strategy or a really good card for your one particular deck. We're talking about on a whole here. And these colors, like you said, green has just not received the love that it should have. When you look at all the green cards that are on the cEDH Staples list, you could probably find like 2 or 3 that were printed in the last number of years that are actually being used. And all the rest are like 20, 30 years old, 10 years old, 15 years old. You know, you've got Wild Growth and Sylvan Safekeeper and Noxious Revival and Llanowar Elves that are kind of on the Staples list.
Tutor.
Yeah,
Ooh,
Worldly
yeah.
Tutor. And the more recent ones are things like Endurance. You know, you've got Endurance and you've got Ignoble Hierarch, which is just another dork in your particular colors. Like nothing really big has shaken up green's color identity in a long time, with the exception of Beseiju, which we're going on a year now.
And for Modern Horizons 1, there was always Collector Oof. Collector Oof is still probably like the most powerful green card you could just slam onto a cEDH table.
Absolutely.
Right now.
Collector Oof is really great, but Modern Horizons 1 was in 2019.
Yeah, exactly. Still years ago.
Years ago. It's 2023 as of the time of this recording, and that's 4 years ago is what we're talking about. And that's brutal. Like, that's rough. And 4 years, you know, we got, like I said, Endurance and stuff like that is a little bit more, you know, it's 2021. Yeah, it's 2021 is Modern Horizons 2. 2 years ago is when we got the last really good green piece. That's an eternity in cEDH. We're talking about eras, and they only last months. That's how fast this meta can change. But, you know, after the Commander 2020 era, everything else just wasn't good enough. You know, you get little edge case like commanders that are in a certain color, but green as a color has just gotten weaker and weaker. White has gotten stronger. Red has just completely exploded in strength to where it is probably, in my opinion, one of the strongest colors in the format. You really suffer not running red nowadays.
I actually just put that thought out into the Twitterverse last night after playing at a local cEDH event, where a Thrasios Bruce deck just like buried me. It just buried everybody in the table at advantage through like kind of the traditional Thrasios things. But rather than kind of messing around with the Tymna stuff, it just had all of the best white and red cards in addition to the like value heavy Thrasios cards. Like if we look at Thrasios Bruce, like Thrasios Dawnwaker, it is a very strong archetype that, as we've seen, we're looking at tournament data over the last few months. It's actually one of the best converting decks to top 16 amongst all the top archetypes, amongst the most played decks. It's the best converting deck actually to top 16 amongst the top 10 most played archetypes over the last few major tournaments. That deck is kind of almost in the same place as Thrasios Tymna was in the past, where you kind of only have green in there because you want to play Thrasios in your command zone. You have your dorks, which are good for activating Thrasios. You have Gaia's Cradle. Worldly Tutor is useful for finding Dockside or Emil. But past that, there's not that much green in that deck. It's like you have your Gaia's Cradle, which really helps to activate Thrasios. You have your dorks. And of course, you have Seedborn Muse.
Veil of Summer.
And those,
one
Summer,
other. Yeah.
And those are like your impactful green cards. And the rest are just really show off how good red and white has gotten over the last few years. And then, of course, blue has always been great. Blue is still like the best color in CEDH.
You're right. I was wrong. It is blue. What am I thinking? I'm smoking crack over here. It's absolutely blue. I just really love red, and I was trying to slip it in there. It absolutely is blue. But Thrasios Bruce used to be a joke. Used to be a joke deck. Yeah, people didn't even, they're like, what is that? What are you going to double strike something? Get out of my face. Here's my win con. And not anymore. It is absolutely formidable deck that you should not take for granted or, not take seriously when you're sitting across from it at a table now.
And with all of that being said about decks becoming outdated, we have two much smaller points that do need to be talked about a little bit. And of course, one thing that can make a cEDH deck outdated is changes to the ban list. We all know this is a weird thing about cEDH, is that we are playing what is intrinsically a casual format in a competitive fashion and trying to break what was kind of made to be a non-breakable format. In philosophy, and cards are not banned for cEDH, except for once. Flash was so oppressive that a lot of cEDH people were able to convince the EDH rules committee that just this once, Flash could be banned for cEDH and help out the enjoyment of a lot of still EDH players, us, because we're EDH players, without impacting normal EDH much at all, if at all. After the unbanning of Protein Hulk, Flash just became so oppressive that they were able to convince him to ban it. And then, of course, that did impact some decks. Tymna Thrasios was a quite a bit worse deck when it was no longer a Flash Protein Hulk deck. Protein Hulk decks definitely still exist. They're just not wildly oppressive Flash ones, right? So that definitely outmoded a lot of decks instantly. The banning of Flash.
Flash was absolutely the strongest strategy by a mile. It was Flash and everything else. And it was Flash Hulk. And you cast Flash, you won the game. And you can win at instant speed with absolutely no board state whatsoever. Kind of like we talked about with Oracle Consult, but you could do it at instant speed with one and a blue open. And when it got banned, Hulk as a strategy went through the floor, bottomed out entirely. Hulk still exists today, but it is absolutely a tier 2 strategy. And I know there are people that with Abzan Hulk lists and Minsk Hulk lists, and they're fine, they're strong and stuff like that. But I'm sorry, Hulk is kind of difficult to get on the board. It costs 7. So there is no just casting it and winning the game. You got to usually cheat it into play and then find a sacrifice outlet for it. Then still be able to work through the interaction and all this other stuff. And you have to assemble multiple lines, which requires all these otherwise dead cards that you could draw, which have to pivot your Hulk lines. And you used to not be able to have to do that. You cast Flash, you get Hulk, you get one pile, and that's it. Because one of those pieces of Hulk was Thassa's Oracle. And so you didn't have to go get a Grand Abolisher and all this other stuff to try and secure your combo. You just won. That was just it. And you could do things over top of it and all this other. It was crazy how good it was. They banned Flash. Hulk just went from an A+ tier to a B- tier immediately. So these bannings can sometimes make a deck immediately outdated just by them announcing that, and then all of a sudden everyone holding these decks are saying, whoops, now what are we going to do?
In the same vein, it wasn't a cEDH focused banning, but Paradox Engine was also banned at EDH for causing some monumental problems in EDH. It turns out if you just cast a Paradox Engine, you can kind of just bumble around for like 30 minutes without having a plan, which is not very fun for your 3 opponents in your casual, fun-focused format.
Yep.
So Paradox Engine was banned, and when it was banned, it did take out a decent amount of, especially like mono blue or blue X artifact focused archetypes that wanted to cast a Paradox Engine, cast an artifact, untap all your mana, make a lot more mana, cast an artifact, draw cards somehow, all this kind of stuff, like Arkham Daxon. Good old Arkham Daxon was a really popular commander back in that day, who could really easily turn an artifact, a Paradox Engine, into a win, thanks to his tutoring ability. Go get your Urza's blueprints and draw a bunch of cards. Ooh! I'd play, just took it out.
I'd play Urza. I'm sorry, I'd play Arkham Daxon to this day if Paradox Engine wasn't banned. It would be my number 2 deck behind Godo. Mm-hmm. I loved that deck. It was so much fun. You go get Paradox Engine. It was actually, Paradox Arkham was its name. It was literally in its name. You go, you get Paradox Engine, cast a spell, untap, go get Sentinel Flute, and then you'd find your combo. It was very easy to assemble, and it was Paradox Engine was the crux. It was the linchpin of that deck. And when it was banned, there was no replacing it. It was a dead deck immediately when it was banned. The other one was Sisay. Not Sisay Weatherlight Captain. It was Sisay something else. I've already forgotten it. That's how outdated it was. It was the Azorius it was the Azorius Sisay. And you go get Paradox. It was called Paradox Sisay. And it had a very similar effect. You go fetch a thing, and because you could cast a Mox Opal because it's legendary, and you could search a legendary permanent. So you go find Mox Opal, cast it, do a thing, and all this other junk. But it was immediately dead too. And people have tried to recover those decks with things like Adaptive Arkham and stuff like that, but they just don't function. They're just not there anymore. And so these bannings of Paradox Engine and Flash have made it so these strategies, they just don't exist, and they immediately make a deck not only out of date, but just completely null and void, quite frankly.
And in that same kind of vein, one last little thing. Silver bullets get silver bulleted. For years and years, it would be really popular to see something like Blood Moon or even Back to Basics be played, and restrict your opponent's mana, make them so they can not make very much. And you know what card blew this all apart? This is the one example I have for this, that we have for this. Dockside just makes those kind of mana denial strategies pretty bad.
Yeah.
Deny everyone their mana so they can't interact. Dockside player says, well, I have 2 mana. I'll play Dockside. I have 12 mana.
And they're mountains. Goes, thank you very much. Thank you, Blood Moon. They're mountains. I can cast it.
I'll cast my Dockside off my mountains. Then I'll make my 12 treasures. Does anyone have any responses? Oh, all your lands are mountains. That's funny. I'm going to win the game now.
Yep, exactly. And this was something that this is usually the quintessential example of that. Most people, back before Dockside was printed and became so popular, people would have Blood Pod. They would have those quintessential stack/advantage decks, and Blood Moon was one of the kind of the key elements. Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon were what kind of shut down opponent strategies to prevent them from getting out ahead of you because you shut down their mana resources. Well, now everyone plays Dockside, and they don't care if you cast Blood Moon. Matter of fact, they love it when you play Blood Moon because most people can't counter it now because their Underground Sea is a mountain. And so you're just going off unimpeded as a result. And so they absolutely love it when you slam down a Blood Moon thinking that you're going to get ahead, and everyone else just lost the game because of it. And this was so much a thing that you started to outdate your strategy because outdate your deck because this strategy just became so overwhelming. Dockside just became such a quintessential part of this format. If there was a figurehead for this format, one of them would be Dockside and the other one would be Thassa's Oracle. And if you had a Blood Moon, you just felt so bad for casting. You found yourself just holding it most of the time. There are still a few that play it, of course. Magus of the Moon is played in Winota and stuff like that. But that dockside made it so that was kind of the silver bullet against Blood Moon. There is one more, and this one didn't see as much involvement because there were other things like this, but we did see a couple of ones that had tutor-based strategies start to kind of fall out of favor. They're not completely out of favor. Most people still play them, but you've definitely seen a lot less of them. These are things that kind of get hosed to opposition agent. A quick example of this would be Yisan the Wanderer Bard. Basically, its entire strategy is tutoring. And if somebody flashes in an opposition agent, you're just not playing the game anymore. You know, you're not trying to draw a bunch of cards. You're not trying to do all that kind of stuff like Selvala is doing. You're trying to tutor out, you know, toolboxes in 1 through 4 and then combos from 5 through 8. And that's what Yisan did. And this one silver bullet actually scared a lot of Yisan players even out of continuing to play because they thought it'd be so ubiquitous in the format. And they weren't half wrong. A lot of decks that are in black that are mid-range usually still play opposition agent, and they just can't win through it. It's so difficult, especially in something like mono green. It doesn't have straight creature removal that isn't fight spells. It's like its weakness, if you want to call green having a weakness. But like that, there was a lot of trouble with it. And it's though these decks had these silver bullets that kind of really nerfed their strategy. So people were very hesitant to kind of continue to work on the strategy because they knew that this certain thing, like Dockside, was so ubiquitous in the format.
Exactly, Ryan. And I will say, at locals yesterday, I saw a victorious Rocco player hype that nobody had interaction for their Rocco win. Jam a Rocco X equals 4 directly into an onboard opposition agent that they had forgotten about.
Did they at least ignore the May trigger?
They learned that it was a May trigger about 20 seconds after the opposition agent picked up their
Know
deck.
Your deck, people.
Look, yeah, it's
your
tough.
Deck.
It's just tough out here, you know?
It is. Things are tough all over. But come on, it's literally in the command zone staring at you the whole time.
So the Corvold player grabbed a Grand Abolisher out of the deck.
Oh, that's so bad. I feel bad for them. Oh.
Anyways, on that note, everybody, has one of your favorite cEDH cards or decks become outdated? I know Rashmi did for me. We talked about that a lot. Arkham obviously did for Ryan. How did you handle that? Did you move on? Do you still play that deck to this day, kind of hoping against hope that you'll get some new cards for it, or just because you love it so much? Or did you move on to something else? What did we miss today? Did we miss any ways that cEDH decks become outdated? Did we rag on Thrasios Tymna a little bit too much? Definitely let us know. We're on Discord. We're on Twitter. You can find us anywhere there. You make sure to give us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast aggregator. You'd be surprised how much it helps. You can also find us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and more. All links are in the episode notes. That wraps it up for this episode of the Playing with Power podcast. Tune in next time when we talk more about our favorite format in our favorite game, Magic the Gathering. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and we will see you next time.